I would like to thank Professor Raghavan for inviting me to give these 2 lectures in this advanced school. I feel somewhat out of place, you might say out of my depth here, because you are covering very sophisticated topics like structure and representations of complex semi-simple Lie algebras, affine Lie algebras, Kurzweil character formula, Chevalier groups, and all this kind of thing. I must make a confession right at the beginning. My colleagues regard me as someone who is very fond of the uses of group theory in physical problems and very much interested in them. But really, I know next to nothing of the topics that you are covering in this school. And I also see that my distinguished colleague from half a century ago, Professor H.S. Mani, is here, and my nephew Govind is here. First of all, I don't know why they are here, but since they are here, I request both of them to help me. If I collapse, you should carry forward. If there is something I say which is not quite correct, Sridhar is also here. I would like you to intervene, generally constructively and not destructively. Anyways, since your school is covering these very advanced topics, I will not talk at that level. Instead, I have decided to describe to you some vignettes, some stories from the many uses of group theory in physical problems. I want to show you something different, comparatively not very sophisticated, which you may otherwise never come across. My understanding is that most of you are PhD students in mathematics. Is that correct? Except for the honorable exceptions which I mentioned. So my intention is to broaden your understanding, arouse your curiosity and interest in things which lie outside your main area of interest. I will not prove any theorems. I may state 1 or 2 of them. I may give motivations for them. No proofs, lot of assumptions as I go along. I want to begin with an anecdote from long ago to illustrate an important difference between mathematicians and physicists. We all know that mathematicians are interested in very general statements. They find value in statements which have great scope. We physicists, on the other hand, are most of the time interested in particular situations. We would like to use some part of mathematics useful to study some particular physical phenomenon or problem, an application of a part of mathematics for something interesting in physics. Now, many years ago, in the summer of 1965, how many years is that? 46 years ago, E.C.G. Sudarshan, whom some of you may have heard of, he and I were spending 2 months at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. We were attending a program called the National Science Foundation Summer Institute, and it was a 2-month period. And at that time, we were working on a problem which required information about unitary irreducible representations of a group called SL4R. That's mathematical notation. You all know what SL4R is. It is a non-compact Lie group of dimension 15. So we were wandering around the campus, and by the way, it's a very beautiful campus, University of Wisconsin at Madison. And we saw a very tall multi-story building. And there was a sign outside US Army Center for Mathematics. So we went in and they had the specializations on every floor. And I think it said 4th floor and 5th floor group representations. So we went up to the 4th floor, we saw some random door and we knocked. And the voice said, "Come in." And we opened the door and we saw a mathematician at work. So Sudarshan and I said, "We are theoretical physicists. We are spending 2 months here as part of this National Science Foundation Summer Institute. We wonder if you could tell us something about unitary representations of the group SL4R." So he said, in American style, "Gee, I could tell you about unitary representations of SLNR, but SL4R I don't know." This is not made up, it is a true incident, but it illustrates the difference in attitudes between mathematicians and physicists. So, in front of money, I cannot tell lies. This is really our experience, but it has always remained in my mind. Okay. So now I want to begin the technical part of these 2 lectures with the connection between group theory, which is a very well developed part of mathematics, and symmetry in physics. The concept of a group is often called the greatest gift of 19th century mathematics to physics. This is really true. It is a perfect language to describe what are called symmetries of physical systems and symmetries of the laws of physics. My focus will be on continuous groups, Lie groups, and what are called the infinitesimal elements of Lie groups, elements in these groups close to the identity, which are described using the word generators and which make up what is called the Lie algebra. So I will generally follow these sheets which have already been distributed to you. My hope is that you will not have to write too much. You can take down only some additional points which I might make, which are not on these pages. Now, when you think of the word symmetry, generally it is understood in a static sense. You may imagine some physical object in physical 3-dimensional space, and you may ask, what are the geometrical operations that can be applied to this object which does not change it as far as we can see? That is, what rotations, what reflections, what translations in space preserve the appearance of the given object. You can apply this for a cube, a tetrahedron, a sphere, the Taj Mahal, and so on. So this is what I would like to call symmetry in a static sense. It's a part of geometry. But for my purposes, for our purposes, we need to think of symmetry as at a much deeper level. We have to think of symmetries as transformations of variables which preserve the forms of some given equations. So it brings you straight into the domain of mathematics. You have some mathematical symbols, some variables, they obey some equations, and you want to imagine transformations of variables which preserve the equations. Typically, the equations we have in mind are systems of ordinary differential equations or partial differential equations. So this is what I have written here. From the static symmetry of physical objects in 3-dimensional space, we must go up to a much higher level, much more sophisticated understanding of symmetry, consisting of transformations of variables which preserve given systems of equations. The system may be a system of ordinary differential equations of some order, or maybe a system of partial differential equations. Of course, this is the sense in which Sophus Lie first viewed continuous groups, Lie groups. And it is this that I will try to develop. This link to symmetry, the connection between the mathematical concept of a group and symmetry in nature is already present in classical physics. It is very important, but it is much deeper, much more important when one comes to quantum theory. Most of today, all of today, I will be talking at the classical level, and tomorrow I will turn to quantum mechanics. There is one more aspect which I would like you to keep in mind. In mathematics, you may study the structure of a group, structures of Lie groups and Lie algebras as abstract mathematical objects. But ultimately, when you come to applications to physics, we have to use them in a concrete sense. We will have to use what are called the realizations and the representations of groups and Lie groups. You can imagine this means we are interested in physics not in groups in the abstract, but in groups in action, the way they act on physical systems and how they affect the equations describing physical systems. Oh, by the way, you may please feel free to stop me at any point if you want any clarification or explanation, and Mani and Govind will answer your questions. So, let me tell you very briefly what we mean in physics by the words realization of a group and representation of a group. These are standard terms, and I just remind you. Suppose a group is given, capital G, and I denote its elements by little g, g prime, a, b, c, etc. The identity as usual is denoted by little e, inverses by -1 up above, g to the power -1. So, with the usual laws of composition, etc. When do we say that we have a realization of this mathematical object? Now, this is a very, very simple-minded definition. You need for a realization some set, a set of objects capital S and a set of mappings phi of this set onto itself. These mappings must be one-to-one, onto, invertible, etc. And they are labeled by elements of the group. So, for each group element, you need a map phi subscript g of S onto itself. And what are the rules? What are the conditions on these mappings? One for each group element. The first condition is the composition law. If you take the mapping phi subscript g and compose it with phi subscript g prime, the result must be the single mapping phi of g prime g, where g prime g is the result of group composition. So, it is a third group element determined uniquely by g and g prime. That is the first condition. So, composition law. Second, to the unit identity element must correspond the identity mapping. It carries each element of the set S onto itself. Thirdly, the map of the inverse of an element must be the inverse of the original map. Phi corresponding to the group element G inverse must be the inverse of phi G. So, whenever you have an abstract group G, a set S and a family of mappings of S onto itself obeying these three conditions, you say I have a realization of the group G. You may require this set S to have special properties. It may be a differentiable manifold, as it will be very soon in the case of classical mechanics. You may then require that the mappings phi G be what are called diffeomorphisms, various kinds of smoothness conditions which they have to obey, and then you will get particular kinds of realizations. Okay. So, this is the kind of concrete action of a group, a realization which is important in classical mechanics, classical physics, as we will see very soon. The other kind of realization of a group, it's a particular case of realization, is called a representation. In the case of a representation, this set S has special simplifying properties. It is, for all practical purposes, either a real or a complex linear vector space, in which case I will denote it by the letter script V, capital V, and these mappings phi will be non-singular, which means what? Invertible linear transformations of the space V onto itself. In such a case, and then these three conditions must be obeyed. In such a case, we say we have a linear representation of the group G on the vector space V. And as I say, in some applications we need real vector spaces and real linear representations. In quantum mechanics in general, we need a complex vector space and complex linear representations. More conditions have to be usually imposed. I come to them in a moment. This dimension of the vector space V, it may be finite or it may be infinite. Then whatever it is, we say that that is the dimension of this representation of the group. All right? Then there are other properties. Is it reducible? Is it irreducible? And so on. In the case of quantum mechanics in particular, we need complex linear vector spaces V with special additional features. There has to be a Hermitian inner product, and then there are some technical conditions. We call V a Hilbert space, and that is what is needed for the purposes of quantum mechanics. So, if we are discussing group theory and symmetry in the context of quantum mechanics, generally the notation is to write script H instead of script V for the linear vector space on which the representation acts, H to remind us of Hilbert space, and instead of phi of G, sometimes we write capital U of G for the transformation representing the group element G, sometimes D of G instead of the symbol phi, which is usually in the case of a realization. So, supposing you are dealing with the case where you have a unitary representation of our group G on a Hilbert space. So, I press this first button here, excuse me Upendra. So, I just press this one first, right?
Just the space.
What happened? Ah, okay. Oh, it went too far. So, this is okay, right? Page 2. All right. So, in the case of unitary group representation, which is most often what is required in the quantum context, what you then have is for each element in the group a corresponding unitary operator, unitary transformation on a complex Hilbert space. These transformations must obey the group composition law. The unit element in the group, identity element in the group must be represented by the unit transformation of the Hilbert space. U of G inverse must be the inverse of U of G, and the fourth condition which I have added is that these operators must be unitary. U of G dagger, U of G must be the unit operator. Now, I am assuming that you are generally familiar with the properties of inner products, the general definition of Hilbert space. If there are questions about this, I would like you to ask me so that I may clarify and we can proceed. Okay, please don't hesitate to ask if something is unfamiliar. So, we have talked about realizations and representations. as two kinds of groups in action, which is what we need for physical purposes. I repeat that the case of a representation is a particular case of realization. It has some special features. The space on which the action takes place is a Hilbert space or a linear vector space, and the mappings are linear transformations. If at least one question is asked, I would feel more confident, because then I would know that I am communicating. Okay. So now let me start on this idea of the connection between group theory, symmetry, and dynamics in the classical situation, in the framework of classical mechanics. As I said already, tomorrow I will talk about the quantum mechanical situation. So now, suppose you have some physical system in mind and you want to describe it using the laws of physics. And we are talking now of what are called classical physical systems. For such a system, all the physical properties, the various properties of a physical system are described by variables which are real valued in nature. By nature I mean, I don't mean capital N-A-T-U-R-E. They are real valued numerical variables. For example, if you have a single particle moving around in three-dimensional space, its important physical properties would be position at a certain time, velocity at a certain time, energy, angular momentum, and so on. And each of these physical properties would be a real valued numerical quantity. Now, there are many physical properties that a system possesses. We usually choose a set of them which are algebraically independent. When I come to simple examples, you will appreciate the meaning. So we choose a set of independent variables in some way, algebraically independent in some way. Then what will be true is that every other physical property of the system can be viewed as a function of the independent ones. It's an obvious mathematical relationship. Now we come to the concept of evolution in time or change in time. How do you describe the changing physical properties of a given system? Changing physical properties means the various dynamical variables, the various physical quantities depend on time and change with time. And this change with time is described by typically differential equations. I denote them by capital EOM, equations of motion. So if you have a system which are mechanical in nature, the number of independent physical quantities is finite, and the equations of motion would be a system of ordinary differential equations. If you have a system made up of fields, for example, the electromagnetic field or sound or so, things of that kind, typically the number of independent variables is infinite, continuously infinite, and the equations of motion would be partial differential equations such as Maxwell's equations. I will talk most of the time about the case of mechanics, where the number of independent variables is finite and the equations of motion are ordinary differential equations. So now in classical physics, classical mechanics, there are three very important forms of these equations of motion. I repeat for those to whom these ideas may be new, the purpose of equations of motion is to tell you how the system changes in the course of time, how its position may change, how its momentum may change, and so on. So these three important forms of the equations of motion in classical mechanics are the Newtonian form, the the form discovered by Euler and Lagrange and the form discovered by Hamilton. Now, from the physical point of view, these three are entirely equivalent. However, they have different mathematical properties, and as you go from the Newtonian to the Euler-Lagrange to the Hamiltonian form of the equations of motion, the level of mathematical sophistication or power goes on increasing. So, I will describe to you briefly the second, the Euler-Lagrange form and the Hamiltonian form of equations of motion. This will require a little bit of formalism to be set up, and so let me now go ahead with that. The first concept I want to introduce is the concept of the configuration space of a physical system. The usual symbol for the configuration space is capital Q. It is a differentiable manifold of some finite dimension n, finite because I am talking of systems with a finite number of independent variables. So, I do not have the time to explain what is meant by a manifold, a differentiable manifold, and so on. Maybe you have picked up some of these notions in your mathematics training. Let me just take these notions for granted. So, physically, one can imagine the simplest cases the configuration space basically to describe the position, the orientation or the location of a physical system in physical three-dimensional space. That is the simplest situation, and you can keep that picture in mind. Now, if you take a point in configuration space, usually denoted by lowercase q, it is describable, at least locally, by a system of independent real coordinates, and here is a usual notation. Q superscript j, each one of them is a real number, and the index j runs from 1 to 2 to up to n, which is the number of degrees of number of independent coordinates of the system, and this is the dimension of the configuration space. All right. From this mathematical space called the configuration space, two other objects purely mathematically can be constructed, and the kind of description I am giving you of classical mechanics is very different from the way that Professor Mani and I learnt it. I would imagine that today it is done in a much more sophisticated and modern way, and with the passage of years and growing age, I am also struggling to learn these new ways of doing it. So, this is how it is taught these days. You start with an n-dimensional configuration space. Maybe I should just give you the simplest examples of such configuration spaces, so that you have some concrete picture in your mind. If you are imagining a particle, a point particle moving around in three-dimensional physical space, capital Q would be three-dimensional physical space, and the dimension would be exactly 3. Suppose you have two particles, each of them moving in physical three-dimensional space. What would the configuration space be? What information do you have to give to specify the location of particle number 1 and the location of particle number 2 in physical space? You see that for each particle you would have to specify 3 coordinates. So, for a 2-particle system, capital Q will be basically R6 and n would be 6. For a 10-particle system, Q would be R30 and n would be 30 if it is 3-dimensional space. So, you can make other simple examples up for yourself. I leave it to you to discover what is the configuration space for this pointer. Moving around in 3-dimensional space, apart from location, what other information do you need? orientation, direction in which it is pointing. So, I leave it to you to discover what is the dimensionality n in that case. Now, coming back to this development, given a configuration space, a differentiable manifold of dimension n, two other mathematical objects immediately can be constructed. One is written as TQ, capital T, capital Q. It is called the tangent bundle on the configuration space. It is also a differentiable manifold, but its dimension is 2 times the dimension of capital Q. It can also be described with the help of local coordinates, local variables, but now we need 2n of them. N of them are the coordinates which you already have, and the remaining n are velocities, the derivative with respect to time of q1, q2 up to qn. So, you combine the two, the derivative or the velocity is written with a dot on top. So, the coordinates for tangent bundle are q along with q dot, and it is this framework which is used, which is basic for the Euler-Lagrange form of the equations of motion, and you will see the equations very soon. There is another space which also comes out of configuration space purely mathematically. It is written as T star Q. It is called in mathematics the cotangent bundle. It is a different space from the tangent bundle. It is a differentiable manifold as well of dimension 2n, but now the independent variables for this space are the positions as before, and along with them new quantities called momenta, and they are generally written as p with a subscript. So, a point in cotangent space is written as a pair, q configuration and p momentum. The pair gives you 1 point in T star q. This is the framework for the Hamiltonian form of classical equations of motion. In physics, this space is called the phase space. So, it turns out that this phase space or cotangent bundle has very, very special mathematical properties which are not possessed by the tangent bundle. So, the result is that the Hamiltonian form of equations of motion has very strong mathematical properties. These were what were crucial in the early development of quantum mechanics. From the physics point of view, so this is page 2, so I press once. And once more, is that right? Yeah. From the physics point of view, we have the concept of the state of the system at a given instant of time. And there are two ways in which the state can be defined. One is to give the position coordinates q and their time derivatives, or position and velocity at a given time. This will mean a single point in the tangent space. Another way of describing the state at a given instant of time is to give positions, but instead of velocities give the momenta. So, you specify the q's and the p's, and remember all of these are real valued quantities. So, to define the state of the system at an instant of time in the Hamiltonian description is to give the values, numbers for the values of q1, q2 up to qn and p1, p2 up to pn. So, the state is defined by giving 2n real variables, values of 2n real variables. And what happens as time goes on? What happens in the course of time? This point in the space tq traces some path in that space, and you get a trajectory. Equivalently, in the Hamiltonian description, the point qp traces a path in the phase space, and you get a phase space trajectory. Okay. So, this is the picture of motion in the classical realm. So, now I have shown you the mathematical framework used for the Euler-Lagrange equations and for the Hamiltonian. I must now show you what the equations of motion themselves look like. Where do you get the Euler-Lagrange equations from? I think you must appreciate that this development of the Euler-Lagrange equations and later of the Hamiltonian equations took a century or a century and a half after Newton. So, it is a result of the contributions of many people, a lot of work, decades and centuries of work. The final product, the final result goes along these lines. To discover, to obtain the equations of motion for a given physical system in the Euler-Lagrange form, you need to know a certain function of the variables q and q dot. This function, it is a single function, it has a special name, it is called the Lagrange function or the Lagrangian. Now, suppose this Lagrange function is given to you, what do the equations of motion look like? As I told you, equations of motion are in this case going to be a system of ordinary differential equations. What do those equations look like? Here is a very deep principle of physics. This is also the result of decades of work and development. You take this Lagrange function L of q and q dot, you integrate it in time from some initial time t1 to a final time t2. Now, what is the path of integration? You imagine some trajectory in the space tq, some continuous differentiable path along which q of t moves as a function of t in that space, and you calculate the integral of the Lagrangian. This integral is called the action, and the equations of motion come from the following very important physical principle. If you make an infinitesimal change in the evolution, but keeping the end points fixed, that is, you do not change the time t1 or the coordinates at time t1, do not change t2 or the coordinates at t2, but at intermediate times you make small changes in every coordinate q and therefore in every velocity q dot. The principle, the Hamilton principle of physics says, to first order the action should not change, and that is the source of the equations of motion. And then the use of the calculus of variations, which was developed by Euler originally, leads to a system of implicit differential equations. So, what I have written here is a set of equations 6 which you have on your notes. In principle, this is a system of n second order ordinary differential equations in time for all the coordinates q1, q2 up to qn. So, what are the ingredients for the Euler-Lagrange equations of motion? The choice of a function which you call the Lagrange function and the imposition of the action principle, Hamilton's action principle, and the result are these equations of motion. Now, these have a characteristic structure, they are the Euler-Lagrange form, but from the physics point of view, I want you to appreciate the content of these equations is the same as Newton's equations of the 17th century. It is just that in the mathematical treatment, they have a certain very special appearance. Okay, so this is the Euler-Lagrange form of the equations of motion. I need to take a break. I wish you would ask a question. I have to goad you to ask a question. Mani, why don't you say something? So, next is to look at the Hamiltonian equations of motion. All this is important to appreciate the concepts of symmetry and connection to Lie groups and Lie algebras later on. So, none of this is going to be superfluous, I guarantee that. Now, I told you that from the configuration space Q, two other spaces emerge. One is TQ, which is what we use here. The other is the phase space or cotangent bundle. Now, this space T star Q has very unusual properties. Sometimes it is said that this was the greatest discovery that Hamilton made. Of course, he made so many great discoveries. What was the other great mathematical discovery by Hamilton? Quaternions. Then there is something else which he discovered called the optico-mechanical analogy, the similarity between, mathematical similarity between the description of rays of light and mechanics of physical, motion of physical systems, so many things. So, what are the unusual properties of this manifold T star Q? Here I just have to give you some words, I can't go into detail. This space has a mathematical property of being what is called a symplectic manifold. It means there is a canonical one form which exists on this space. It is usually written as theta 0, and in local coordinates it has this expression, momentum times the differentials of the position, p dq. So, this exists on phase space right from the beginning. Next is the exterior differential of this theta 0. It is written as omega 0, and this is the language of differential geometry, which is I think becoming more and more familiar to most of the students these days. This is also canonical, that is to say the space T star Q comes equipped with theta 0 and omega 0, and this is a symplectic structure. What does it mean? It is a two form, and it is pointwise non-degenerate, and it is exact. Its exterior derivative is 0. All these properties are what give phase space in mathematics and in physics very, very unusual properties. These properties, which I now will describe, do not exist on their own in the case of the Euler-Lagrange description of mechanics. TQ is a manifold which does not automatically have the properties which I am now going to describe. What are these special properties? Suppose you take a function little f on phase space. So, you may imagine it written as a function of q's and p's, a function with 2n real independent arguments. Then you take another function g, g of qp. Given two functions f and g, they automatically determine a third function, again a function of q and p, and it is written as a curly bracket f comma g. It is also a function of q and p, and here is its explicit expression. This quantity is, this expression is called the Poisson bracket of the function f with the function g, and it obeys a very important property. It is a Jacobi identity, the Poisson bracket of f with g and then of the result with h plus two more terms by cyclic permutation. When you add them all up, you get identically 0. Now, I am sure you know the Jacobi identity in some other context too, Lie algebras, right. So, here is the Jacobi identity. I would imagine the first time it was seen in mathematics in this context, in mechanics. Okay. So, all these properties, the existence of a canonical one form, the existence of a symplectic structure as it is called, you imagine mappings of T star Q onto itself, T star Q to T star Q, which are smooth. What does it mean? Differentiable sufficiently often, plus 1 to 1 onto invertible. Those mappings of phase space onto itself, which preserve all these structures, which preserve Poisson brackets, which preserve omega 0, have a special name and a special importance. They in physics they are called canonical transformations, and the person who first studied them in great detail and brought out most of their properties was Jacobi. So, I just want to mention at this point that just from the history point of view, Hamilton wrote a set of 4 papers in the 1820s, 1824 to 1830 or so, developing very unusual mathematical properties of rays in geometrical optics based on the Fermat principle. He then wrote, after the papers on optics, he then wrote papers on mechanics. And you can see the amazing correspondences, similarities between the two, which is called Hamilton's optico-mechanical analogy. Now, this work of Hamilton remained a great mathematical curiosity for about 100 years, 90 years you can say, until in 1926, Erwin Schrödinger was inspired by Hamilton's work and was led to the development of wave mechanics. So, Hamilton's work was of great importance for the discovery of wave mechanics. Now, Hamilton did this, as I said, in that period, optics first, followed by mechanics, and in a few years, Carl Gustav Jacob Jacobi, he contributed to this subject. He took Hamilton's work on mechanics to its logical conclusion, and he then gave a course of lectures on mechanics which are very, very famous. They were given, I think, around 1843 or so, and I want to tell you, they were edited by another mathematician physicist of the 19th century by name Clebsch, whose name is known to many physicists. And would you believe it, Jacobi's 1847 lectures on dynamics, edited by Clebsch, have been published by Hindustan Book Agency in Delhi, and they are available, and the cost is only 500 rupees. So, I would urge all of you, those who have an interest in these things, Jacobi's work, lectures on dynamics, are historically very great. So, he built on the work of Hamilton, and most of these concepts, the idea of canonical transformations and all that I have described here, were put into final form by Jacobi. Okay, I have digressed a little bit, but I think it is worth it. Okay, so now I come back to this concept of canonical transformations. Canonical transformations are those mappings of T star Q or phase space onto itself, which apart from being well defined one-to-one, onto, and having inverses, preserve the symplectic structure. The meaning of this equation I will not answer right now. If one of you asks a question after the talk, I will try to answer. This means at the same time, the operation of calculating the Poisson bracket of two functions is unchanged under canonical transformations. Whether you transform the functions first and then calculate their Poisson bracket, or first calculate the bracket and then transform the result, the answers are the same. So, such transformations have the special role in physics. They are the canonical transformations. So, this is the background, the special geometric properties of phase space purely as a mathematical object, and some of these go back to Jacobi 1843 to 47 lectures. Okay. So, now come to the equations of motion. What are the equations in Hamiltonian dynamics which tell you how a system is changing with respect to time? The recipe is the following. For the Euler-Lagrange equations, you remember I told you everything is based on a function called the Lagrange function. It is a function of coordinates or positions and velocities. From there you go to another function on phase space, which is called the Hamiltonian. It is a function written in terms of coordinates q and momenta rather than velocities. And the transition from Lagrangian to Hamiltonian is by a Legendre transformation. So, I will not go into more detail. Here are the equations of the Legendre transformation and the equation which tells you how to get the Hamiltonian given the Lagrangian. Here it is, equation number 10. Now, the all important thing, what does time evolution look like in Hamiltonian language? You said that back arrow will take me to previous page. These were the equations of motion in the Euler-Lagrange form, where q and q dot are the basic variables. Now, the same physical content, but in a new mathematical shape, are the phase space equations of motion. They tell you d by dt of coordinates q are the Poisson brackets of q with the Hamiltonian, and here is their explicit form. D by dt of momentum is the Poisson bracket of p with the Hamiltonian, and it has this form. And if you take an arbitrary physical variable, some arbitrary function of q and p, its rate of change with time is the Poisson bracket of that object with the Hamiltonian. So, what I would like you to appreciate is that you have the Euler-Lagrange way of describing changes in the course of time. You have the Hamiltonian form of describing these changes. From the physical point of view, they are really equivalent. The content is the same, but the forms are very different. And you can see that the Hamiltonian form has a lot of very special mathematical and you might say geometrical features which are absent at first sight in the Euler-Lagrange form, and they are very important for the later development of physics. In fact, a great deal of the early development of quantum mechanics was based on the structures of Hamiltonian mechanics. So, now there is one last, I will not be able to finish at 4:30. I go a little beyond because I have not yet come to symmetry. Now, there is one important thing which comes out of the structure of the equations of motion of Hamilton. Imagine, see, this is a system of 2n ordinary differential equations of the first order. Imagine that you are able to solve these equations explicitly. Imagine. So, you will imagine expressing the set of q's and the set of p's at a time t2, at a later time t2, in terms of their values at an earlier time t1. So, you imagine that you write q of t2 and p of t2 as some functions of q of t1 and p of t1. Those equations, if you are able to find them, have a special property. They are a canonical transformation. This is a special feature of Hamiltonian mechanics. There is nothing strictly analogous to it in the Euler-Lagrange form. So, the concept of a canonical transformation is immediately made use of in saying that the development in time of a physical system, it is called a continuous unfolding of a canonical transformation. I think it is called Hamilton's unfolding theorem. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
The definition of Pj
Yeah.
used to eliminate q dot from equation 10, is it?
Yeah, yeah. You express the Hamiltonian, you express this quantity which is the Legendre transform of L, p q dot minus L of q dot, you express q dot everywhere in terms of p and q, and the resulting expression you call h of q and p. So, you use it to replace q dot by p. Okay. Now, we come to symmetries at last and Lie groups of symmetries. Suppose now you have some Lie group G whose elements act on the configuration space capital Q by a set of mappings. This is what I called in the beginning of the talk a realization of the group. So, I will assume that the Lie group acts on configuration space via diffeomorphisms phi. What does it mean? Smooth, differentiable, inverses exist, it is in, what is it, 1 to 1, on to, into, above, below, everything. It's the nicest possible mappings. So what it means is that take any element of the group, there is a corresponding diffeomorphism of the configuration space onto itself. Each point in capital Q is mapped to an image Q prime, which depends on Q and the group element, and you may denote it in various ways. So this is the basic action of the Lie group on the configuration space. And I remind you, configuration space here is a differentiable manifold of a certain dimension n. Now, when the Q's transform in this way, it is easy to compute that their time derivatives transform in a linear fashion. And here I have written it, and what is involved in this linear transformation law for velocities is just the Jacobian of this transformation, of this mapping. All right. Now, when do we say that this Lie group G is a group of symmetries for this physical system? G is a group of symmetries for the system if the Lagrangian is unchanged, if the Lagrangian is invariant. That is, the function L is given to you at the start, you substitute for its arguments the new Q prime and their velocities, and you make a lot of simplifications, you find at the end you get back the old Lagrangian. So a group, a Lie group acting on a configuration space for a given physical system is a symmetry group if it preserves the Lagrangian in this precise sense. If it doesn't do this, it is not a symmetry. It may act on configuration space, but it is not a symmetry group. Assume therefore that we have a symmetry group, a Lie group of symmetries. Then from this property, if it holds, many consequences follow, and I can only describe them, I cannot prove anything. But they are interesting, and they are written down, you can think about them. Each element of the group acts on phase space via a corresponding canonical transformation. That transformation is determined by the way the group element acts on configuration space. So it is phi tilde G acts on T star Q, it is determined by phi G acting on capital Q. These canonical transformations preserve the Hamiltonian just as the group preserved the Lagrangian. So I have written it more clearly here. You are given the action of the group on the configuration space. You have a point transformation on configuration. It leads to a canonical transformation on phase space. The fact that it is canonical is encoded in this equation, and the fact that the Hamiltonian is preserved is expressed by this equation. So if you have a symmetry group, the corresponding transformations preserve the equations of motion. What does that mean? It means you have a system of ordinary differential equations telling you how the system evolves. You apply your group of symmetries, take any element and apply it to a solution of the equations of motion. The result will be another solution in general of the same equations. So the important thing is that it is the equations, the differential equations which are preserved, not individual solutions in general. Now you ask, since I have a Lie group, what else can be said? You can imagine studying the action of group elements which are close to the identity element in a natural sense. And because you have a Lie group, you can do that. Take a neighborhood of the unit identity element, take elements infinitesimally close, and see what happens to all of this. You then find that such elements close to the identity act via canonical transformations which are themselves infinitesimal. That is, they differ from the identity transformation only by a small amount. And then when everything is said and done, here is what happens via these elements close to the identity. I now go to the Lie algebra of my group of symmetries. and I denote it by G with a line below. Is that the standard mathematics? Is one of the standard notations for the Lie algebra. Sometimes you put a lowercase g, I suppose, but that has to be Gothic G, and I don't know how to write it. So I will denote the Lie algebra of a Lie group G by the same capital G with a line below. So this is a real linear vector space. Now I am not involved here with complex Lie algebras. All my Lie algebras are real, and this one is a real linear vector space of some dimension. So a general element of this Lie algebra is some real linear combination of these basis elements. When all this physics happens, when G is a group of symmetries for the given physical system, this is what happens. Every element in the basis for the Lie algebra is represented physically by a corresponding function of the variables q and p. J capital subscript r function of q and p. And if you take an element in the Lie group very close to the identity, the way it acts on the variables of the physical system, the changes it produces in the q's and p's are small changes determined by these capital J's. So they are called the generators of the action of the Lie group on the physical system. Now these generators are, and these are very delicate points, you may not understand the significance immediately, but at least let me mention them. The generators, the functions of q and p representing elements of the Lie algebra, they are determined only up to additive constants. They are not exactly determined, each one is determined up to a corresponding additive constant. These generators are constants of motion. What does it mean? They have numerical values which do not change in the course of time. So here is the vital link from the physics point of view. If a group is a group of symmetries and it is a Lie group, its Lie algebra is represented by constants of motion, things which do not change in the course of time. So these capital J's have double role to play. On the one hand, they tell you how the group acts on the q's and p's, what are the changes it produces on the q's and p's. At the same time, the same J's are unchanged numerically in the course of time. That's the meaning of the phrase constants of motion. Lastly, and this I certainly hope appeals to you, if you calculate the Poisson brackets among these capital J's, you get back the Lie algebra relations of the Lie algebra of G. I denote here by CRST the structure constants of the Lie algebra G. You all know structure constants, these are real. What are they? They are real, antisymmetric in R and S, and obeying a bilinear Jacobi identity. So the functions which determine how the group acts give you a realization of the Lie algebra of the group. All this set of results is collectively usually referred to as Noether's theorem. And who is this Noether? It is Emmy Noether, the great algebraist who did this work in 1917, 1918. She was what was it? She was in the Hilbert School, right, in Göttingen. So this is all called Noether's theorem. Okay. So now I come to the last page for today. And part of the last page for today. So here is the basic fact. Well, the things that I described at the end of the last page, a more sophisticated way of conveying all that these days is by something called the momentum map. But I do not want to take time to explain what it means. At least I would like you to know there is some concept called the momentum map, which is very, very elegant and describes all the things that I said in the previous transparency in a very compact way. So, I will now summarize what I have done today. And I will read out from my notes and you can compare with the projection. And at the moment I am involved only up to this part. Tomorrow I will use this part. The statement that a Lie group, which is a group of symmetries of a physical system, the statement that such transformations act as canonical transformations is very, very important in classical physics. It has its analog in quantum mechanics. The statement that the Lie algebra is represented by physical variables which are constants of motion is the second very important and deep fact. So, what it means is that three ideas get connected in this whole picture: the concept of a Lie group, the idea that a certain Lie group is a symmetry for a physical system. When it is a symmetry, its action is by canonical transformations, and when that happens, the things that build up the action are constants of motion. There are too many ideas I know, but only three. A symmetry group, the action by the group being canonical transformations, the generators of this action, the things that build up the group action, are constants of motion. All this together is a beautiful complex of ideas which I find extremely beautiful. And I would like to mention a few months ago, I think January and February or February and March, we have written 2 papers in the consecutive issues of this journal Resonance describing most of these things. So, you might like to have a look at it and it will fix all these ideas better. So, the case where, so here I have written, the basic facts are these: a Lie group, which is a group of symmetries for a physical system, acts via canonical transformations. The concept of a canonical transformation is well defined when you have a phase space, which depends on the Hamilton description of motion. The action of the group on the physical system is through generators. Generators are things which represent Lie algebras. These generators, because you have symmetries, the generators are constant with respect to time. So, it is these 3 concepts: existence of symmetries, Lie group of course, existence of generators, the fact that the generators represent the Lie algebra, structure constants come in, and the fact that they are constants of motion. You can say all of these put together is basically Noether's theorem. Strictly speaking, Noether's original theorem dealt with cases which I have called today point transformations. That is, transformations where a group acts on the configuration space by point to point mapping, which can then be raised to act on phase space T star q. So, this situation corresponds to the generators being very simple in their momentum dependence. They are linear in the variables p, but in q they can have any dependence. From physics point of view, there are other symmetries also which are important. They may not arise from point transformations. They may not be definable at the level of configuration space. Such symmetries are also important. Nowadays we call them non-Noether symmetries, but we study them in the same spirit, and their generators may not be linear in the momentum variables. So, to recapitulate, we have, I think I am doing it for the 3rd or 4th time, but this is important to see what are the key ideas. It is important that the equations of motion come from an action principle. That is very important. Otherwise, all these links among these concepts would not hold. So, the crucial role is played by the action principle. When you have that, and when you take account of Hamilton's and Jacobi's work, you find the way a system develops in time is a continuous opening up of a family of canonical transformations. In this background, a Lie group, which acts as a group of symmetries of the action, if the action is preserved, the equations of motion are preserved. In that case, solutions of the equations of motion are mapped into other solutions in general. And the things that carry out this mapping are these capital J's, and they are constant in time. So each one of these is an independent fact, and the beautiful thing is how the Noether theorem ties them all together. Repeat: symmetry, infinitesimal generator, constant of motion. Okay? So all these are put together. So these constants of motion, the generators, they give you a concrete realization of the Lie algebra. Okay? So this is why in the classical situation, Lie algebras are very important in physics. So I would like you to keep this overall picture in mind. I will stop here, and tomorrow I will start on the quantum mechanics part. Yeah. Yeah. One question at least instead of clapping would be greatly appreciated. Yeah. Yeah, please.
So when you said this notion of non-Noether symmetry.
Yeah.
Symmetry in that case is just some kind of abstract symplectromorphism of the cotangent multiplicity.
It will turn out to be a symplectromorphism. As a matter of definition, here for the case of point transformations, the defining property was the Lagrangian does not change. In the generalized non-Noether case, we say if under a certain transformation the Lagrangian changes at most in such and such a way, then it will be a symmetry. Its generators will be constants of motion. It will preserve the equations of motion, but the capital J may not be linear in momentum.
So the group then still acts on configuration space.
No, not on configuration space.
So it doesn't have an action on Q at all?
Does not have an action on Q. It has only an action on TQ or T star Q, not on Q. Those groups whose action makes sense at the level of Q, they give rise to point transformations. And one says generally in physics, they are kinematical in nature. Their action can be described in terms of positions of things. For example, rotation, translation in space, these are all things which act on positions alone, basically. And their action on velocity and momentum can then be derived. But suppose you go in non-relativistic mechanics to what is called a Galilean transformation. A transformation from one reference frame to another which is moving uniformly. That's also a symmetry. It's a symmetry of Newton's mechanics, but it is not a point transformation. Okay. Yeah.
The second question was, just take the simple examples that we take. Just a point particle in free space.
Yeah.
What would these things be? For example, what are the groups of symmetries?
That will come in the later part tomorrow. I have a section on space-time symmetry groups. So there I will give you examples, a whole lot of them.
So this momentum map is from where to where? And can you briefly say what it is?
Yeah, see, we physicists, when we have to deal with a manifold, we would like to use coordinates. We are uncomfortable with this coordinate-free notation and all that. It's quite a struggle, at least for my generation, to use this language which is intrinsic. The momentum map, here what I have said is, I'll make it very, very down to earth. If we have to deal with a specific Lie group, at least my generation, we would say, please show me how to describe each element of the group with a set of independent real coordinates. That's what I would start. Once you give me a coordinate description of the elements of a Lie group, then I will go to the corresponding Lie algebra in a certain corresponding basis. then I'll have a corresponding set of structure constants, and so on. All right. And then I would say, as I wrote here, for each basis vector in the Lie algebra, for a physical system for which it is a symmetry, there is a corresponding function on phase space, which I have denoted capital J of R. All right. And this is the way I would build it up. And then I would say, as I have said, the J's give you a realization of the Lie algebra. What do I mean? The Poisson bracket of JR with JS equals CRST JT, where the C's are the structure constant, plus some other constants. The momentum map describes all this, which we do it in a very laborious way, where the statement, what is involved here is a mapping from T star Q to the dual of the Lie algebra of the group, period. And it encapsulates everything from the phase space to the dual of the Lie algebra, G star underscore. So it is just a compact, a very concise, elegant way of describing all this. Okay. Yeah.
Is there a way to appreciate these ideas by seeing them play out in a simplified, fairly simple example, just in classical setting?
Yeah, see, the simplest cases are where I will describe rotations, translations, the Euclidean group, the Galilei group, and so on tomorrow. For homework exercise, since you have given board and chalk, nothing could get simpler than this: the free non-relativistic particle in 3 dimensions with a mass m. So at time t, you imagine that the particle is at the position q of t, which is a vector in 3 dimensions, real vector. Of course, I assume you have chosen a coordinate system, an origin, and Cartesian coordinates, and it is an inertial reference frame, etc. Okay. For a mathematician, I would need to define what we mean by an inertial reference system, but I will assume that is understood. For a free non-relativistic particle of mass m, the Lagrangian has a very simple form. It is 1/2 times the mass times the square of the velocity vector. So this is the simplest Lagrangian that physicists study. You can see explicitly the following situations, transformations. If you shift the origin by a fixed amount, by a vector A, then Q is mapped to Q prime by a translation. Obviously, this Lagrangian is invariant, right? Because this is a constant, it is not a dependent function of time. So Q prime dot equals Q dot, so the Lagrangian is unchanged. This, by the way, is a point transformation. So you have the simplest example. Here is a Lie group, the group, abelian group of translations in 3-dimensional space, which preserves the Lagrangian. Therefore, it preserves the equations of motion. By the way, what are the equations of motion for this system? They're very simple. Mass times, this is Newton's first law. An isolated particle with no forces moves uniformly and in a straight line, etc. So these are the equations of motion. You can see that they are preserved by these transformations. The corresponding constants of motion are the momenta. So in this case, the J of QP are the momentum variables. You will see this little more in detail tomorrow, but this is an indication. Can you see another group of symmetries of this system? Point transformations. Remember, these are vectors in Euclidean 3-dimensional space, space obeying the laws of Euclidean geometry, which means they're homogeneous and isotropic. So this is the homogeneity part. What is the isotropy property of this Lagrangian? It says if you apply an orthogonal SO3 rotation to Q, Lagrangian does not change. That's also a group of point transformations, symmetries of the Lagrangian. and the corresponding generators, constants of motion, are angular momentum. Maybe that is good enough. It's a very simple case. Huh? Fine. Oh, okay, okay. Okay, thank you. Huh?
There is free now, and tomorrow we meet again.
Thank you.